Do you remember? The crowd was much larger than the police expected. The funeral procession snaked through the bustling downtown district, picking up mourners at each stop. The death brought the community together in ways nobody had imagined. He wasn't the man some would have hoped for, but he was theirs, and they would mourn him however they saw fit. The procession filed past a venerable old building, mostly like any other, albeit much larger. The building had no beef with the mourners, their clothes, their way of speaking. The building never said their kids were too loud. It didn't seethe and heave with hate. But the people inside the building were another matter. They leaned out of their windows toward the mourners. At first, it was just taunts that exploded out of the building, then metal screws and bolts, and then chemical-soaked rags, then buckets of water at a funeral procession. And so the mourners responded with words and fingers and bricks. All that had been thrown at them was returned measure for measure. The anger of one side matched the other. But then something upset that equilibrium. The crowd was, after all, much larger than the police expected. And so the action and the reaction brought a police action. Not against the people in the building. The police came for the mourners. They led not with moral authority or even common decency, but with stick and club. Blood boiled, blood was spilled. One paper reported men were flung down, women were dragged out by arms and shoulders and pushed headlong down the street. Eyewitnesses reported police pursued and attacked several people as they tried to escape, and at least 2 would claim that officers choked them when in custody. This is not a headline from 2015 or 2010 or 1980. It happened on the Lower East Side in New York in 1902. The victims of hate were not, as we might imagine, African American. The funeral was for Rabbi Jacob Joseph, and the victims were Jews. Accounts vary, but there is one constant: fierce, furious police action directed at Jews. The Yiddish Daily Forward accused police of bloodthirsty anti-Semitism and claimed that the officers on the scene were beating up anybody who looked Jewish. Now, while such blatant anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish behavior is mostly an increasingly distant part of our history as Jews in America, the same is sadly not true for blacks in America. From George Zimmerman's acquittal in the Trayvon Martin case, to Ferguson, Missouri, and the killing of Michael Brown, to the racial terror that took 9 lives, pastors and parishioners, men and women, young and old, at the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina, we are grappling with the reality that racism still permeates many aspects of 21st century America. African American males have learned the dangers of walking while black, knowing that from the halls of their schools to the streets of their cities, they have to watch their backs. Throughout our history, Jews have grown accustomed to looking over our shoulders too, watching what we say, following the rules, sensible or otherwise, from crusaders to Cossacks, from bank conspiracies to blood libels. Jews know the reality of living with fear. And today, is it not invariably men of color? From a statistical standpoint alone, the picture is an ugly one. People of color roughly constitute 2/3 to 3/4 of our prison system. Our society is marred by vast racial disparities, one that stigmatizes and targets young black men for arrest at a young age, unfairly punishes communities of color, and exacts a tremendous social cost. Just 2 weeks ago, the Center for the Study of Race and Equity in Education at the University of Pennsylvania released a new study showing how school discipline practices and policies impact black students in every K-12 public school district in 13 southern states, including Florida. In 132 southern school districts, blacks were disproportionately suspended at rates 5 times or higher than their representation in the student population. At a staggering total of 121,468, Florida schools suspended the highest number of black students in the nation last year. Today, it is black men who are targets. In the past, it was Jews. It was us. Now, some may protest, but that was anti-Semitism. Look, I don't want black kids killed either. But you have to admit there's a criminal behavior in those communities. And if we're honest with ourselves, we might have to acknowledge that part of us, or more than part, feels this way. And there must be something that they're doing. Those statistics must point to some problem, some cultural issue, some communal pathology, a lack of parental responsibility. Consider the words of a New York City police commissioner, nothing if not an expert on crime and its causes. New York's top cop found it astounding that with 1 million of one race living in New York, perhaps half of the criminals should be of that race. Amongst the most expert of all the street thieves, the commissioner asserted, are their boys under 16 who are being brought up to lives of crime. Many of them are old offenders by the age of 10. It must be said that the child emulates the adult in the matter of crime percentages, 40% of the boys and 20% of those arraigned in the children's court being of that race. Important data, to be sure. Except the police commissioner who said it was not current Commissioner William Bratton, but Theodore A. Bingham. And the statement was made not in 2015, but in 1908, 6 years after Rabbi Joseph's funeral. And the race he was talking about was Hebrews. If anyone could identify with today's young black American men deemed criminal for no other reason save their ethnicity, it would be Jews. Our entire history and sacred heritage repeat again and again to protect all those who are not part of the majority culture, reminding us that we were strangers in the land of Egypt. We know the heart of the other. We know the experience of discrimination and persecution. And yet we have come far as Jews, especially here in St. Petersburg, where we now have our 3rd Jewish mayor. We've come a long way from restricted beaches and hotels and from the signs on the causeways reading, "No Jews, no blacks, no dogs." But not all have fared as well. Last month, the Florida Holocaust Museum opened an original exhibition entitled Beaches, Benches, and Boycotts, the Civil Rights Movement in Tampa Bay. Entering through doors labeled for the doctor's separate waiting rooms, whites only on one side and colored only on the other side, the visitor is quickly reminded that Tampa Bay was deeply racially segregated at the dawn of the Civil Rights era. And many local institutions and establishments resisted integration for several years after Brown versus the Board of Education and the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Until 1964, the legal measure was separate but equal. But from the start, it was clear that separate was never equal. Before the turn of the 20th century, Florida spent $13.12 per black student, as compared with $26.66 for whites. By 1910, the spending gap had increased. For every $10 spent on a black student, the state allocated $36 for white pupils. St. Petersburg's poorly funded black schools offered no more than a 6th grade education. In the last 50 years, much has changed. Before becoming a judge, James B. Sanderlin was the lawyer who successfully sued Pinellas County schools so that they would desegregate. The federal desegregation order remained in place until 8 years ago. And I'm sure we've all read the investigative report published in the Tampa Bay Times, Failure Factories, that detailed what has happened since. While we may not attend the schools that the Times identified, as Jews, we must not ignore what is happening around us. If anyone, it would be Jews who would remember, who would stand shoulder to shoulder with African Americans, united in a shared history as despised and targeted ethnic minorities. We know the heart of the stranger. for we were strangers in the land of Egypt. Today is the day we must remember. One of the names for Rosh Hashanah is Yom HaZikaron, the day of remembrance, the day for remembering. This is Yom HaZikaron. And on this Yom HaZikaron, who maintains the memory of the Lower East Side funeral riot of 1902, or Commissioner Bingham's Jew-hating rant? In the Unatana Tokef, we say of God, Tizkor HaNishkachot, you remember everything we've forgotten. Have we forgotten our history as genetic scapegoats? How could that be? The social critic historian Irving Howe challenges us. So long as native hatreds were taken out primarily on blacks, they were less likely to be taken out on Jews. Howe continues, if Jews have been the great obsession of Christianity, blacks have been the great obsession of Americans. At this season of confession, it is time to confess. Maybe many of us have been just fine with that arrangement. Maybe we've been more than happy to have ethnic amnesia. As long as those memories of the knock in the night begin to fade, as long as those of us with light-skinned sons are not afraid for them to look at, let alone speak with, neighborhood law enforcement, maybe we can sleep a little easier at night. But what do we see when we take a good hard look at the world around us? Can we shut our eyes and forget? Can we ignore that which we as Jews understand as well, so well as we see it reflected in the lives of our black brothers and sisters? On this Rosh Hashanah, recalling Abraham's trial as a father on Mount Moriah, do we see our son Isaac bound on the altar, terror in his eyes? Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel tells the story of how, as a 7-year-old, he first read the text of the Akedah, the binding of Isaac. He recalls that as he read the tale of Isaac's near death at the hand of Abraham, he began to weep in empathy and fright. His rabbi knelt down next to him. Why are you crying? You know that Isaac was not killed. And Heschel remembers, I said to him, still weeping, but Rabbi, supposing that the angel had come a second too late. And the rabbi comforted me and calmed me by telling me that an angel cannot come late. An angel cannot be late, concludes Heschel. But man made of flesh and blood may be. The angel was right on time for Isaac. And the angel came too late for Michael Brown, for Trayvon Martin, for Freddie Gray, for the faithful attending church Bible study that Wednesday evening in June, for Florida children deprived of an education, for African Americans whose votes are suppressed, for the black men who languish in prison, for all of us who are offended by the implicit and explicit messages of hatred embedded in the symbolism of the Confederate flag that continues to fly so prominently today across the South. For so many years, we were the ones bound by hate and bloodlust, helpless on that altar. For generations, the Akedah represented Jewish suffering, Jewish trauma, Jewish death. We were Isaac. That insecurity hasn't left the Jewish soul. How could it? But after millennia of being Isaac, on this day, in response to all that we see and all that we have come to know, the Jewish people, you and I, can be the angels. Not the ram, silent, defenseless, a martyr. Not the ram, the angel. The angel who comes on time. The angel who is not afraid. The angel who speaks for God. The angel whose voice is clear, cutting through fear and cynicism and suffering. Avraham, Avraham. Sometimes it takes more than once to get the message. Hineni, I am here. I am accountable. In this nation, at this moment, the voice of the angel must be our voice crying out, Al tishlach yadcha el hana'ar. Don't put a hand on that boy.